Hi everybody, welcome back. I think we're on lesson 18 now. Let me check. 19. Lesson 19. And this is our 5th mini unit. So as I always do, I just have like this quick introduction. So if you are new, if you're just joining us for the first time, this is meant to be sequential. So there's lots of awesome videos for kids that teach them skills on YouTube, but the difference with this is meant to be sequential, like I would do in class, where each day we sort of learn something to add to the last time. So if you're just coming for the first time, I suggest either going all the way back to lesson 1 and building up, or at the very least going back to lesson 17, because this is a little mini unit that builds on each other. So that's my little blurb. This works best if you stay there, adults, if you are with your kids, because the idea is you are going to facilitate the conversation much like I would when I'm teaching. I'm just not there to do it. So I can ask the questions, I can give the opportunities for discussion, but then it's up to you to carry it out. So passing the baton. So forgive the gloves. The room I am using for this is the quietest room in our house, but it's also the coldest. So I've got to keep myself warm here. So queuing up our prior knowledge, right? Thinking about what we have already done. These are the previous 2 books we did in this unit, A Desert Scrapbook and 3 Days on a River in a Red Canoe. Last time we read this one. So kiddos, take a second and turn to that grown-up. Tell them, what do you remember about this story? And then grown-ups, after they've answered you that, after they've told you what they remember, I want you to ask them what they thought the author's purpose was. Remember, this whole unit, we're focusing on author's purpose and genre. So what do they think the author was trying to do with this book? So pause, have those 2 big conversations, and then come back, because I am going to go over what I want you to remember. So hopefully you just talked about this story. So just to remind you, this was a story where a family took a canoe out for their first ever family canoe trip for 3 days. And they had some adventures along the way. They had to lower their canoe down over a waterfall. They woke up in the middle of the night to a storm, almost blowing all their things away. So it was quite an adventure, and certainly made me want to give that a try. I don't know about you. So that was a really great adventure. We talked about the genre, because one of the big goals for this unit is thinking about genre, right? The type of writing we're reading. We're reading books all in the narrative form, so books that are all telling a story. And then some of those books might be fiction, they might be not true, or they might be nonfiction, they might be real or real information. So we're trying to figure out where we think things fall. And after reading this one, where do you think this one falls? Does it sound like it's a made-up story? Does it seem like it might be real? I was thinking that too. I think this might be real. So it's not narrative nonfiction, because it's not telling us the story of something true. It's telling us the story of somebody's day, somebody's life. So that's a little different. It's not biography, because it's not telling us somebody's whole life story. So that means it falls into this category. The group of nonfiction narrative that are somebody's story about themselves. So that could be an autobiography where they tell their own whole life story, a memoir where they tell stories from their life, or a personal narrative where they tell the story of a day. So a small moment. So what do you think? Does this seem like their whole life, some different stories from their life, or a small chunk? You're right. This is a personal narrative. This is a small chunk. Like one event, the trip, is what that story is all about. So that makes it a personal narrative story. And so that personal narrative, we have to think about what we think the author's purpose is. What are they trying to do? So I finally made a graphic. I've been asking you this question, and I realized I've never held up a graphic. So the author's purpose, usually for kiddos at this age, falls into 3 categories. Are they trying to entertain us? It's just for fun. Are they trying to teach us something? Or are they trying to convince us to think or do or believe something? So we thought this book was kind of a combination, didn't we? We thought it was a little bit of just sort of telling your story, but there were those moments, remember, in the middle where the author was really trying to make sure we learned some specific things. So I'm going back to that page here. Remember, they were trying to teach us how to tie knots and how to cook the different foods that you would eat on a camping trip. So it seems like this book was a story, a personal narrative, but they were also trying to make sure we learned some stuff while we read. And that's kind of cool, but also kind of tricky about books, that sometimes authors will do more than one thing at the same time. So just like this author was telling us a story for fun, but a lot of it was about teaching us about camping. So that's great. So now that we've thought about that story, we're going to move into a new one. You might have read this book before because it's very popular. It's a really beautiful book. So when I hold it up, I want you to give me a thumbs up if you've read it before. Is that a thumb up? So Owl Moon is illustrated, is by Jane Yolen and illustrated by John Schoenherr. And we're going to read this whole book all the way through without stopping, because this is one you just want to experience the whole way through. So before we start, I want to make sure you're primed with the right things to be thinking about. So we've thought about the last book. So your job while I read this is going to be two things, okay? The first is what we were just talking about with our other book. I want you to be thinking about what is the author's purpose, and so what kind of a book this might be. Okay, is it teaching us information? Is it telling us a story for fun? Is it trying to convince us of something? And what kind of narrative writing it might be. Okay, so that's your first job. Your second job is to really be listening to the words in this book, because that's why we're going to read this one all the way through without stopping, is that the words in there are really descriptive, which means they really help you imagine the story. So those are your two jobs, okay? So we'll check back in when we are done reading. Let me turn you a little bit more. Okay, here we go. Owl Moon by Jane Yolen. Sorry, I know the screen is reflecting off of here. That's a little distracting. All right, here we go. Owl Moon. It was late one winter night, long past my bedtime, when Pa and I went owling. There was no wind. The trees stood as still as giant statues, and the moon was so bright the sky seemed to shine. Somewhere behind us a train whistle blew, long and low, like a sad, sad song. See them here, just walking out of their house. I could hear it through the woolen cap Pa had pulled down over my ears. A farm dog answered the train, and then a second dog joined in. They sang out, trains and dogs, for a real long time. And when their voices faded away, it was as quiet as a dream. We walked on towards the woods, Pa and I. Our feet crunched over the crisp snow, and little gray footprints followed us. Pa made a long shadow, but mine was short and round. I had to run after him every now and then to keep up, and my short round shadow bumped after me. But I never called out. If you go owling, you have to be quiet. That's what Pa always says. I had been waiting to go owling with Pa for a long, long time. We reached the line of pine trees, black and pointy against the sky, and Pa held up his hand. So that means like stop. I stopped right where I was and waited. He looked up as if searching the stars, as if reading a map up there. The moon made his face into a silver mask. Then he called, "Hoo, hoo, hoo, hoo," the sound of a great horned owl. "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo." Again he called out, and then again. After each call he was silent, and for a moment we both listened. But there was no answer. Pa shrugged, and I shrugged. I was not disappointed. My brothers all said, sometimes there's an owl, and sometimes there isn't. We walked on. I could feel the cold, as if someone's icy hand was palmed down on my back, and my nose and the tops of my cheeks felt cold and hot at the same time. But I never said a word. If you go owling, you have to be quiet and make your own heat. We went into the woods. The shadows were the blackest things I had ever seen. They stained the white snow. My mouth felt furry from the scarf over it that was wet and warm. I didn't ask what kind of things hid behind the black trees in the middle of the night. When you go owling, you have to be brave. Then we came to a clearing in the dark woods. The moon was high above us. It seemed to fit exactly over the center of the clearing, and the snow below it was whiter than milk in a cereal bowl. I sighed, and Pa held up his hand at the sound. I put my mittens over the scarf, over my mouth, and listened hard. And then Pa called, hoo, 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 hoo. I listened, and I looked so hard my ears hurt and my eyes got cloudy with the cold. Pa raised his face to call out again, but before he could open his mouth, an echo came threading its way through the trees. Hoo, 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 hoo. Pa almost smiled. Then he called back, hoo, 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 just as if he and the owl were talking about supper, or about the woods, or the moon, or the cold. I took my mitten off the scarf, off my mouth, and I almost smiled too. The owl's call came closer, from high up in the trees on the edge of the meadow. Nothing in the meadow moved. All of a sudden, an owl shadow, part of the big tree shadow, lifted off and flew right over us. We watched silently with heat in our mouths, the heat of all those words we had not spoken. The shadow hooted again. Can you see that owl? It's way up here, right here. Pa turned on his flashlight and caught the owl just as it was landing on a branch. For 1 minute, 3 minutes, maybe even 100 minutes, we stared at one another. Then the owl pumped its great wings and lifted off the branch, like a shadow without sound. It flew back into the forest. "Time to go home," Pa said to me. I knew then I could talk. I could even laugh out loud, but I was a shadow as we walked home. When you go owling, you don't need words or warm or anything but hope. That's what Pa says. The kind of hope that flies on silent wings under a shining owl moon. So thanks for joining me in that story. Now your job is to turn and talk about the words that stuck in your mind. Because remember, I said one of your jobs was to pay attention to the words the author was using. So take a minute, pause here. What were some spots you remember exactly the words the author used? So hopefully you all just shared at least one spot where there were some words that stick in your mind. I know the words that always stick in mine, pardon me, are where the child describes the feeling of like a wet scarf on her mouth. Because I know I very much remember that feeling when you're breathing in the cold and your scarf gets all wet. I also really like that moment when they spot the owl. And we're going to talk about the words they use there in a minute. So let's go back to a few spots. We're going to do something called close reading now, which is where we go back to a few spots and look at some specific words and unpack what they mean. So we're going to go back to page 14. Here, the child says, I could feel the cold as if someone's icy hand was palm down on my back. Now, do you think someone's cold hand is actually on their back? No, we don't see anybody else in the picture. It's just her paw and her, or him. And this is just a way of saying, of describing what that feels like. Sometimes you have a cold spot and it reminds you of when someone has a cold hand on you. So this is like a metaphor, basically. It helps you imagine just what something feels like by using a specific type of image. So we can picture that cold hand on her back, on their back. All right, let's go to page 21. Here, they say, but before he could open his mouth, an echo came threading its way through the trees. Now, are they actually talking about a real echo? Now, an echo, if you've ever had that happen to you before, is when you say something and then that sound actually bounces off a wall or a canyon or a mountain far away, and then your sound actually bounces back so you can hear your own voice a little while later and a little quieter. So like if I went into a long hallway and I said, hello, a moment later I might hear, hello. Now that doesn't mean that somebody else is there talking. That's my own echo. That's my voice bouncing off and coming back. You can hear that sometimes if you go under a bridge, a big bridge. If you honk the horn, you might hear the echo of the horn, or you might hear the echo of your voice. So it's describing an echo, but is their voice actually bouncing off of something? No, that echo wasn't really an echo. That's another metaphor. What was it they were hearing? They were hearing the owl. So the dad was calling, hoo, 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 hoo. And then they heard back, hoo, 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 hoo. And it sounded almost like it could have been his echo. But in this case, it wasn't an echo. It was really the other owl. We have 2 more pages to look at together for some close reading. All right, here. This is the words that stuck in my mind. So I didn't want to tell you them earlier so that we had time to talk about them together here. So it says, for 1 minute, 3 minutes, maybe even 100 minutes, we stared at one another. What do you think the author, pause here and talk together. What do you think the author is trying to say by saying for 1 minute, 3 minutes, maybe 100 minutes? So hopefully you just talked about that. That the author is really just trying to show that moment when something really exciting happens, it almost feels like time stops. You're just so into what's happening, you have no idea if it was just a second or a long period of time because it was just so exciting. And maybe you've had that happen to you before. You're doing something and next thing you know, it's been 20 minutes and you didn't even know that time went. So it's a really great way, instead of just saying, I really enjoyed it, it was exciting, right? They were showing us, instead of telling us, they were showing us, Jane Yolen is showing us time. I have no idea how long that time was because I was just so excited by what I was seeing. And our last page to talk about. Here we go. I knew then I could talk. I could even laugh out loud, but I was a shadow as we walked home. That's a tricky one. Talk here as a family. What do you think they're talking about when they say, I was a shadow as we walked home? So that's a tricky one. But basically, it's another metaphor. She uses a lot of figurative language or descriptive language. She's basically saying, even though I knew I could talk, it was okay now because we had already seen the owl. That experience just stayed with her, and she was still just as quiet. So it was another way of showing us her real feelings about that experience. So now that we've done our close reading of a few different pages, now it's time to think about that second big question. We already did the first question. The second big question I asked you to think about was the genre and the author's purpose of this book. So let's review. When you're thinking about author's purpose, usually books fall into one of three categories. Either they're just entertaining you, they're teaching you something, or they're trying to convince you of something. And then when we're trying to figure out the genre, we have to decide, okay, is it a fiction narrative? Is it a fiction story where somebody made this up? Or is it a non-fiction story? So please take a second, talk about those things together. They're really connected. So you can just discuss them at the same time. And then let's come on back and we'll kind of think about that together. So teachers have been discussing about this book for a really long time because everything about this book makes it seem like it's a personal narrative, right? One of the clues is it's told in the first person, which means just like in the Red Canoe story, the first person was telling the story, the person was telling it about themselves. It was the same in this book when Pa and I went owling. So who's the narrator? Who's telling this story? Can you figure that out? Yeah, it's our little child here, and we're not sure if it's a boy or sure if it's a girl. But if it's a personal narrative, that means it's the author telling the story. So that would mean Jane Yolen was telling her own story. So we've discussed this book a lot, and it could be either. It could be a personal narrative where the author was writing a true story about her life, or it could be something sneaky, something called realistic fiction. Now that's where somebody writes a story that seems like it could be real, but it didn't really happen. So this is where you have to use your own critical thinking and decide what seems more likely to you. Does this seem like it could be a personal narrative, or does it seem like it's realistic fiction? They're so close and it's hard to tell. And that's really up to you to have your own opinion. My honest opinion is all the details and the specific things from this, how well Jane Yolen describes the feeling of the cold and the fuzzy scarf on her mouth and the sound of the owl and how she felt. All of that really makes me think this is probably personal narrative. But it could be Jane Yolen is such a creative and wonderful writer that she could imagine all those details and make a story that's realistic but still fiction. So that's tricky. So then if we go back to the second part of that question about the author's purpose, is she trying to just tell us a fun story? Is she trying to teach us something, or is she trying to convince us of something? This is another tricky one. It's almost like another combination. In a way, it's just a beautiful story to listen to, but it's also teaching us a little bit about owls, or what it's like to go hunting owls, or not hunting, but looking for owls. So it's kind of a mixture of those two. So it depends. If you're saying it's realistic fiction, maybe it's more just to entertain. If you're saying it's a personal narrative, it might be a little bit more of teaching us something, or it might just still be a mixture of the two. But she's definitely not convincing us, right? She didn't try to make us believe that owls were really important. She didn't convince us that we need new laws to protect owls. She didn't convince us that owls were dirty and gross and we should get rid of them, right? She didn't try to make us believe something or do something about owls. It was that she was either trying to teach us a little bit about owls and owl watching, or she was just telling us a beautiful story about owls. So there's not always a really clear answer, but it is still really good practice to think about those two things. So thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. Now that we've thought about those questions, I have 4 different suggestions for extensions you could do from this. So the first one is just a writing extension. This is a beautiful narrative, right, telling a story. And she told it in the first person, right, using the word I. I went to the store with my mom. And so now it's your chance to write your own narrative. Maybe you went on a special walk somewhere. Maybe you had a special moment with a grown-up that you want to tell the story of. Maybe you had a special day with your grandmother or a special day with your big brother, right? And you can tell that story. The second suggestion is to try drawing or painting a picture of an owl. Now, I'm going to put you back to this page where we see the owl up close. And what I'd like you to do, if you choose to draw or paint this owl, you might want to come back to this picture or even take a screenshot of this picture grown up so you have it on your computer. But look at this. Look at all those details. We can see where the flashlight light is shining on the owl. We can even see the light reflecting the owl's eyes. Look at those details. So all those details take time and practice to get really good at. So maybe you could try that too. So maybe you want to try making a picture like this one, or maybe you want to go to find another image online and use that to inspire your work. That's also fine. Okay, your third suggestion. Your third suggestion is to do a little bit more work with the sounds or the calls of owls. So in this book, you heard me trying my best to sound like a great horned owl. What I'm going to do right now is play for you a recording from a scientist of a real great horned owl. So get ready. So this is actually 2 different owls. So what I'm going to do is include a few different links for you of bird societies. So there's ornithological societies and Audubon societies who are really concerned with protecting and learning and educating people about birds, especially owls. So I will include a few different links from Mass Audubon, or the Audubon Society in general, and from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So they are the premier people in learning and teaching about birds. So I'll include some links there to learn different owl calls. And then your 4th suggestion is to really focus in more on the words in the story. So I asked you to think about the words before we started, and then we went back and thought about what words you remembered. And then we did some close reading where we found some really memorable parts of the words. So now my thought is, why don't you get a notebook or a page of paper, and I want you to play the video again, but don't watch it. So you're not looking at it, you're just listening to it. You could turn the brightness of your screen all the way down, or you could turn the computer away, and then just write down the special words or phrases that that catch your memory. So maybe I would write down fluffy mouth or icy palm, right? So you just keep track of the word choice that this author uses, because she's really known for that, the word choice she uses in her writing. So to review your 4 ideas, your first idea is to write your own story that's a narrative. Your second suggestion is to try drawing or painting an owl, much like the artist and illustrator did in this book. Your third idea is to start learning some owl calls yourself. And your 4th is to go back and listen to the word choice in the book and keep track of the special language you hear. So that's a lot of ideas, but that should keep you busy. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time for Lesson 20.